Thank you, Karen. Hola.
Hello. Tanto tiempo, Carmen.
No llega nadie, te tienen botado aquí.
Así nomás. No saben valorar estos minutos de conexión. Para mí son los más valiosos.
Sí, pero hay veces que no hay chance.
Es que esas son las pequeñas vainas que es difícil de replicar de la presencialidad. Porque antes de las sesiones donde, hola, perfecto, yo soy esto, yo soy el otro, ¿qué estás haciendo? Y esa conversación de pre y post sesión son súper enriquecedoras.
Sí.
Because you're there anyways. Entonces, bueno. De a poquillo.
Voy a estar multitaskeando, así que perdonará. Viste que ya tenemos a Alfonso con día y fecha y hora.
Buenazo, ¿cuándo?
El martes a las 4. Martes 31.
Bacán.
Ya le mandé invitación, bloqueo.
Buenísimo. Simplemente asegúrate que podamos editar esa invite.
Ok.
Hola.
Jacob Morenus.
¿Qué dice?
Hola.
How are you?
I'm fine. It's a great idea to speak in English, so that way I can practice my fluency.
Great.
Es como en el colegio.
English fluency.
We can do that anytime, man. So you're pretty much like the genesis of thinking, right?
Genesis of thinking?
Thinking.
De los thinking.
Ah, thinking. Yeah, something like that.
You're directly or indirectly responsible.
Yes, something like that. Yes, because I at the end I make them know each other, you know.
Of course.
And I initially started working with them, and I started this little seed of having a great culture and have an excellent way of doing everything, you know.
Yeah.
Very in a very high standard, with a very high standard.
Yeah,
And,
they talk very fondly about you.
Really?
Yeah.
Yes, I love them. To be honest, I love them because I think that they are great guys. Maybe some of the best talent I have the opportunity to work with. So I love them, to be honest.
Good.
Great people. They're great talent.
Love is a deep word, so I can only respect your amount of appreciation.
Yes.
Yeah, but they speak very fondly of, and it was interesting.
Yes, I am. I love to build that kind of teams that are very cohesive in the way of being like a cult, you know.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know why, but the teams that I lead tends to become a cult, very union, very, you know, very passionate about everything. But
It's gonna be interesting to have your say whenever we have the culture week about this best practices, because talking about things that work, you've done it a couple of times, and having the cult-like aspect is always good because it creates cohesion, right?
Yes, I read several books about that topic because it's something that I'm very passionate about that. But yes, of course, maybe I can give some of my experience.
Always experience works. Great. Hi everyone.
We're practicing English today in the pre-session lounge.
Yes, we're practicing our fluency.
Amazing. Well, welcome everyone. Welcome Diego. Welcome Ileana. Welcome Luis, and welcome Gonzalo.
Hola, hello everyone. ¿Cómo estás?
Hi. How are you today?
How is everybody today?
Amazing. Everybody's excited.
Excellent. Glad to hear it.
Halfway there to the weekend. So
Yeah. Getting
Oh,
close.
come
Yeah.
on.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So I guess we have a few more people joining us.
Yeah,
Wait a few more minutes.
I think we're one down. Let me have a
Yeah, all good.
quick look.
All good. Carmen, nice to see you. Been a
Nice
while.
to see you. How have you been?
Very well, thank you. Yeah.
How's Quito treating you?
Pretty good so far. It's nice to have things opening back up and getting out there. Like Fernando and I went out to dinner the other day. It was really nice.
yeah, that was a good restaurant too.
That was tasty.
Where
Recommend.
did you go?
3,500.
I haven't been.
It's tasty.
Amazing. So I think we're ready to go. So just let me start recording. I think we are recording. So
We'll do a round of intros.
yeah. So first of all, thank you very much, everyone, for being here. We're very excited to have you this morning with us again in El Programa. In this occasion, I want to give a very warm welcome to Gunther Hartwig that is with us again. He is a friend of the house that has been supporting Buen Trip for a long while and is second time mentor in this El Programa. Just so that everyone knows where Gunther is coming from, well, he is Director of User Experience in Drone Deploy, and he has a vast experience in the startup world of Silicon Valley. And just to talk a little bit about everything, he has had different roles that go from UX to product and design, mixed in different ways. And he has worked in companies you may know, like CircleUp, Zynga, and YouTube, among other companies that he has been involved. So if you ever read any book of UX, it's most likely that he knows the author. So because he's been a practitioner in the aspect for so long, and Silicon Valley is a very cohesive place, right? So that's where Gunther is coming from. I know that he's gonna tell you a little bit more about himself in just a while, but so that Gunther is in context, I please want everyone of you to give a very brief intro about your startup, yourselves, and what are your most pressing problems UX related, so that Gunther can be in context with what you're doing, okay? So in order to start, I would like to welcome Diego from Mox.
Thank you. Nice to meet you, Gunther.
Hey.
I'm Diego from Mox. Mox is a technology infrastructure company. We connect payroll to their users by connecting the payroll system, handling systems to financial entities. And with this process, users can access their payroll information. About UX, we have some challenges. Some of our platforms are user consumer platforms, which UX and financial environment, it may mean that UX needs to be very refined and create trustworthiness in the process. And yeah, basically some of our questions will be about how to communicate trust in the UX or in the platforms.
Super. Thank you very much, Diego. Now, let me welcome Jacobo Moreno.
Hi there. Hi, Gunther. Nice
Hola.
to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Hola. Okay, so Taxo is a SaaS platform that creates automatic tax reports so that accountants who serve freelancers, SMBs, and people who offer their professional services can do their job easily and more efficiently. We work with an app and web where we do a lot of digitalization and automatization of all the gathering of all documents, of those documents, sorry. So we first collect and classify invoices automatically. both from sales and our expenses, and then we create automatic tax reports. So essentially what we do is to make the accountants' lives easier, you know, and to that's our vision. Mhm.
Great.
Thank you very much. Jacobo, do you have any, where are you with UX related questions?
About the UX, we have been working on doing that the platform do what it has to do.
Mhm.
We are taking a special care of several details about our UX. So we consider that the platform is in good shape, but not perfect. We have a lot of things to improve.
Okay.
So we are very, very excited about knowing your experience and learning from you.
Amazing. Thank you very much, Jacobo. Let me welcome Estefania Moran from Pronto.
Hi, everybody. Pronto is the SaaS platform B2B. We help companies to increase the collection money, reduce collection costs, and give a better payment experience to users. With the platform, you can manage your customer, customize your collection flow, setting up channels, generate payment links, and you have real-time reporting for decision making. We started in January. We launched the application in this month. We get the first account, and we hope for this year to reach 100 accounts in Ecuador. Thank you.
Mhm.
Super.
Awesome.
Estefania, you have any any question with regards to UX or design?
For the moment, no.
Amazing.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Now I'm gonna welcome Ileana from Vitruvian.
Hi, I'm Ileana. I'm the CEO of Vitruvian, a B2B SaaS company for apparel retailers that helps shoppers buy their correct size when buying clothing online with virtual sizing technology. So some of our UX challenges from the retailer dashboard side is making sure our onboarding process is clearer. And a lot of that has to do with like the visuals, with the instructions for how to them to properly set up and utilize our technology. And then from the shopper side, also making it more intuitive for them to know, you know, the instructions for how to virtually measure themselves with our technology.
Cool.
And making sure it aesthetically all looks good. Yeah.
Sure.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you very much, Ileana. And last but not least, Luis Teran from Sabroso.
Hi, Condor. How are you doing? I'm Luis, the COO of Sabroso. And at Sabroso, we basically make it easy for companies and employees in LATAM to order daily meals. The problem that we're solving is that this whole process for LATAM companies, it takes a lot of time and it's very manual. From how the menu is passed down to employees to how they order and manage it. We solve it by giving a platform to each and every employee so they can order and manage their own meals, while we give companies automated reports so that they can speed up the process.
Mhm.
And basically our challenges right now in the UX, we are in the stage that we are going out from the MVP design that it's honestly horrible to like a new UI. We haven't implemented UX yet. So this talk is like on point with the stage that we are.
Mhm. Okay, cool. All right, just I'm taking a couple notes here, so writing that down. Well, thank you all. I really appreciate getting those overviews. You guys have got a lot of very interesting and useful product and business ideas going on here, and it's really cool to hear the breadth of what you're working on. And obviously there's some overlap and similarities, right? But there's also some differences with what you all are doing, right? As you can see in here from as you described it. So today, I'm going to just hey, Leo, are we ready for me to jump in here? Is that the stage we're at here? Right on. So today what I was planning to sort of chat about and sort of share some information on was particularly focused on areas of user research. Hearing back from the team from Wintrip and all that, so they suggested that that might be one of the things that's most useful for you guys, that the stage that you're at is still sort of trying to sort of fully understand your users out there. You're already at a point, we've got a basic business plan, a basic and an app and all that sort of stuff going, but it's ways to really sort of get an understanding of who these people are who are using your tools, right? And then from that, make decisions that can help drive the business and stuff like that. Those lead into some of the other questions that I heard here too. Of course, it's like, you know, visual design, as you mentioned, some of the other just sort of like specific tools or systems you might want to put in place. But of course, making a lot of those decisions is, it's helpful to actually know who your full people are, right, to begin with. And one of the things that's interesting talking about this too, is also, we can probably dig in a little bit more deeply on people's specific questions when we schedule some office hours, right, which I've been talking with the team about doing. So here, I'll just try to keep it a little bit more general, right, some tools, techniques, tricks, and stuff that I've been using, you know, through the projects that I've been working on, right, and then we can dig in a little deeper when we do the office hours, because I can already see a few things, right, saying, oh yeah, here's a tip, here's a trick, some things I've thought about that would be applicable there. The other thing, of course, is as we go through this, want to make sure that it's conversational, right? Please ask questions if you'd like, right? At any point, you don't have to wait. You know, you use the Zoom raise your hand tool or whatever. And then, of course, people have knowledge about all this sort of stuff. So it's not like I'm like the only guy who knows anything, right? If there are things that you guys know about this stuff that are worth sharing with the team, please do so. And, you know, and if you disagree on something, that's part of it as well, right? Like, oh, this has been effective or that hasn't been effective. That's always a good thing to be able to chat with everybody about, right? So with that being said, maybe it's time for me to pull up my prezo here. And yeah, and I can do a little bit more of an intro on myself and such, just to give you the context. Okay, so can everybody see what we've got going on here? Right, I will go into the slideshow mode, and as we can step through, right? So my topic today, trying to talk about some practices and techniques for you to get a strong understanding of your users and audience. And I'm drawing from, at this point, quite a bit of experience in doing these things. So happy to share that with y'all. So again, our agenda for today, a little bit of an overview of kind of what user experience design is. And then a little bit, I want to talk a little bit about how I am sort of thinking about like product development, right? And how you go out and actually build your products and features. And that, of course, being how research specifically relates to that. And you can see here, there's a bunch of topics to touch on this sort of research side of things. It might have been pointed out to you, there was a version that I did of this last year that was a bigger sort of picture of an introduction to user experience and product design. Leo said that you guys had the recording of that had been made available to you all. So some parts of this are pulled from that. And some of these areas I actually culled down a little bit so we don't go too far in depth in them. But if you always want to watch that program or look at that sheet and talk about that at some point, that's great as well. That make sense?
Super.
Cool. All right. So getting back into this, a little bit about me, right? So yes, I'm Gunther, as you said. I am a director of product design and user experience. Have been working in the software space for a while. You can tell I've been around a little bit. So probably about 20-25 years, mostly around in Silicon Valley in California, and at a wide variety of different kinds of firms. So I've been lucky to be sort of work on a number of different types of projects in a wide variety of industries. Most recently, I'm working in a company called Drone Deploy, which is leveraging we're doing what we call site reality capture. And that is taking what are now basically fairly easy to get a hold of, quadcopter drones, providing tools that allow people to control these devices and then gather information from the photographs that you can take from them or other kinds of things, to give you insights into things like agriculture, construction, energy, and that sort of thing. So it's pretty neat. It applies a lot sort of different kinds of sort of like scanning tools, interaction techniques, and stuff like that. If we have some time later, I can share some of the stuff that I've been up to down here, because it's been super exciting to bring some of these technologies to here to Ecuador and see people, doing stuff for like conservation efforts and all that sort of thing with it. And that's been one of the things that's been very exciting to me lately. Some of the other things that I've touched on just in the industry is like Circle Up was a financial fintech platform that I worked at a startup for a while. Zynga, which you may have heard of, is a gaming company. YouTube obviously needs no introduction. I was there quite a while ago at some, this point. Sonic was another company that did a wide variety of video-oriented types of things, authoring for Hollywood studios, making DVDs and that sort of stuff. I also have an educational background in anthropology as an undergrad, right? And then got a more technical degree at Georgia Tech in Atlanta. And as for many of us in this field, right, our backgrounds come from all over the place. Some people are technical, some people are artistic, some people are, more of like on the research side of things. So I've been gathering a bunch of that stuff over the years and ended up where we are, right? Which is a great place to be. I feel very lucky to have been able to work on a wide variety of these tools, some of which have seen some good success. Okay, so that being said, sometimes people do ask this question: what is user experience and product design? What does that mean, right? Well, you all probably have some bit of an idea, right? But this is a way that I like to sum up with a couple of quotes, right? Design is a couple of things. Design is the process by which we go and think about creating something. And then the design is also the output of that, right? So one of the emphasis being, particularly in the areas that we're talking about, design needs to be really thinking about those people who are actually using this tool, right? Or whatever it may be that you're creating. It's not about us. And that's one of the things I also like to draw with people, and particularly when you get into the field of design, it's like, we're not making art. Art and design are not necessarily the same thing, right? Art has great meaning and purpose, and often can be very personal, right? Design is very much more focused on an outcome that has a specific thing that we're trying to accomplish, right? It's a particular utility that we want to provide for people and that sort of thing. And there's significant overlap between the two, but they're not exactly the same, right? User experience is a fuzzy term too. It's fairly broad, and it's also been taken to be called other things as well now. You might hear people say things like customer experience and that sort of thing. But in the big picture thinking, user experience is in here. It sort of encompasses all the aspects of how somebody interacts with the company, its services, and its products, right? In the case here that we're talking about, it's very much more about the products versus the other kinds of things like customer service and so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, really, when it comes down to it, those things touch on each other, right? But as I said, our focus here is going to be much more about the thing itself, the product, and so on and so forth, and how people actually specifically deal with that, and how we understand them and how they're dealing with it. That makes sense to everybody? And again, this is one of those where lots of people have lots of different definitions. I pulled a couple of these, but if you go and look it up, right, it'll sort of come around, in this sort of area. But yes, it's always a process of debate. And I can say this, having done this for quite a while, some of these terms didn't even exist when I started, right? And so it's constantly a matter of like reinvention and redefinition as we go along and learn more. And so a little quick overview, some of the things that go in and we call sort of the things that we look at within user experience design, right? I'm not going to go through all these super quickly. You can see from that chart on the side, just sort of the ways in which sometimes things overlap, some which seem relevant and some of which don't, right? Like the fact that architecture is one of the things we talk about in here too. But like architecture and a lot of those practices in there have a big influence on the way we do a lot of software design. But anyway, you can see the research, product design, things we call information architecture, interaction design, how to do prototyping, testing, and all sorts of stuff, all fall within this sort of bigger umbrella. And nobody is actually super expert at any of these things. All of it is very much a collaborative process or ways in which we tap the expertise of a wide variety, diverse group of people in order to accomplish the thing that we want to at the end of the day, which is making useful tools for our users and customers, right? So touching on that, a little bit about kind of my take on product development, right? And here's the thing, and going back to it, it's a collaborative process. Nobody makes this stuff on their own. Nobody's the one who is the know-all, be-all, end-all of all this sort of stuff, right? In particular, we're talking about the development process of like creating software in particular. This is also applicable to other things, right? There's sort of this grouping of people who need to come together in order particularly to create the UX, right? And I put it in here with what we often call the triad, right? We've got, yes, product design, user experience design, research, 1 point. We have product management, right? As well as engineering. I mean, at the end of the day, in a lot of these things, you don't get anywhere without an engineer, right? If you're ultimately reductive, you don't need anybody else besides a programmer to make things, but it helps to have these other perspectives that go along with these things, right? So it should be, very much sort of a feedback loop and exchange between these folks. But the other thing to remember is that we have a lot of other people who have knowledge and information, right, to share. And you can see on the right here, business development, sales, customer support, marketing. We have to be collaborating with them. And then obviously at the end of the day, really hearing from our customers and users is the most critical thing, right? So at the end of the day, it's a mix of all these sort of things in order to create the tools that work and help our business succeed. All right, this is a dense slide. I'm going to pause here for just a quick second to give you just a sense of like, this is kind of one of the ways I think about when you talk about the development of a feature set or product, right? This can be something that's like a large scale or boiled down to like a simple feature that you might be adding. But you kind of have to go through the bulk of these steps in order to get anything done and out the door, right? And like I said, there's a lot of information here. We won't necessarily spend all day on this, but I want to make reference back to this because I'll talk about this with regard to some of the other research techniques we're going to be using. But in general, as you go through, right, there's always this point at the beginning where you want to discover, plan, learn about, the business need, the customers, and all that sort of thing in order to, decide what you want to do, working through and making sure you've defined it all very well, right? And then through a design phase, right, that particularly, creating like the things that some people will interact with, building and testing it, right, to make sure that it's actually out there working, preparing to get it out to the public, right, and then making it generally available. And again, just keep this sort of in mind as we go through. I'm going to talk about that, particularly with regards to this research side of things and where key sort of tools and techniques come up and are applicable throughout that. I'll take a quick pause. Is this making sense to everybody? Any thoughts, questions as we start going on here? Cool. Just to refine that further, right? And again, won't go on with these other things, but here's some of the things when we think about like the activities that are conducted throughout this process, right? And while, like I said, we'll be focusing a lot more on research stuff versus like execution of the actual, artifacts or what have you, format. But just to give you a sense of like some of the activities. Again, as I've been working on them recently, but this sort of process can change a little bit. And there's lots of different ways people think about the processes here, right? You might have heard terms like waterfall, Scrum, Agile, et cetera, right? Those are all different frameworks that people can work within, but this is one of those things. In each and every single one of those, you still kind of have a lot of these sort of milestones and markers you have to reach in order to get to the end goal. All right. Yes, lots of stuff there, lots of words in Prezo. Sometimes it can be hard to absorb, but let's move on. So let's jump into the topic at hand. And let me double check the time. So everybody, okay, we're good. Research, right? Right, here's the thing to remember. We're not our customers. We might think we are, but we're not. We need to make sure that we're actually really talking to them and making sure that we understand them. Right? So that we can service their needs, which might not be mine. They might not be my needs at all. They might not be like me at all. Right? So it's very important that we're cognizant of that. Sometimes people get too caught up in thinking that they themselves are the users, and that can lead to disaster. Right? So just to put it out there, user research strives to understand characteristics, goals, and behaviors of a product's users, right? So by doing that, we have a wide variety of techniques in order to reach that understanding, a number of different ways in which we can go about doing it and how that we apply it, right? At the end of the day, a lot of it is about building empathy. Understands people's goals, attitudes, motivations, the challenges they face, the obstacles, things that, trigger them one way or the other, and also like emotional things, right? Because that can play a part in, how people interact with your product. If they're frustrated, right, they might abandon it. And that might have nothing at all to do with you, but it's something to just bear in mind, right? So empathy is a big one that we like to focus on. Okay. When thinking about research, there's a number of things, topic areas that could be of interest. And I've sort of set this out there to give people a sense, like it really can cover a lot of different areas, right? We've got the notion of how people are, what the engagement of somebody is with the products and services we're offering, the specifics about features, the elements within it, the mechanics and, what they do within it. Things like the whole package itself, the platform, as you might call it, right? And then obviously there's the business and strategic side of things. We won't necessarily be touching on that today, but all of these research elements do interact with each other. And that's one of the other things I like to encourage everybody to remember is people should have access on your team to as much information as possible. Just because somebody's a designer doesn't mean that they don't want to know what the business reasoning is, for example, and vice versa, right? Somebody who's working on the business side would like to understand why it is that you came to that design decision. So it's always important to, as much as possible, make information transparent, share it out to everybody, right? So that you can get a bigger picture understanding, because that'll oftentimes lead to like easier decision-making and less argument back and forth, right? When people are set up and have an understanding of something, they can move more quickly, right? Make decisions, and it just improves communication. So that's one reason why I like to include that sort of side here when we talk about like business and strategic stuff with reference to design. Okay, going back to our big spreadsheet there really quick. I'm going to talk about a bunch of these things on here, but the thing I wanted people to focus on is thinking about, as we go through this process, what are some of the key questions that we're going to be wanting to ask people and how we understand them in relation to what we're working on, right? I'm not going to go through all this. We'll make this material available for you guys later. You can take a look more in depth, but just to give a sense, and then let's actually dive into some stuff to make sure we're still moving. Okay, but actually, I'm going to jump back to this in a minute. One of the key things when setting up in order to do research is we need to ask ourselves what, why, how, when, right? And so doing research of any kind, I like to put forward this series of questions. What am I actually trying to understand, right? Why are these questions important? How will I answer them? Those are kind of the biggest ones, right? Because oftentimes people think they're going to do some research, but they don't actually know what they're trying to answer. And so you might choose the wrong technique or the wrong timing or the wrong audience to do it. So it's very important to establish these sort of things before you get going. And this will be one of the ones for you guys, right, as in the stages that you're at. It's like, what are the real questions that I need to answer now? What do I want at this stage of my development of my organization, right? There's going to be others that you're going to want to answer later, probably. But it's also important to, like, really, when you're developing at the stage you guys are at now, really understanding what are the key ones I want to understand now versus later. So it's worth spending time thinking about that, besides just jumping in and grabbing some sort of technique or methodology and saying, oh, this is somehow going to solve my problem, because it might not be the right way to get the answer. I'll refer back to this as we go through. All right. So it's also really important, going back to that, to actually put together a plan. And one of the things I've been hoping, of course, in doing these presentations right here is maybe give you guys something actually to use as opposed to just a lot of talk, right? So I definitely advocate for everybody, come up with a plan, right? Know the things you want to do, go back to it. I've got a plan template that I've been using for years, which is a helpful guide. I'm happy to share that with everybody, but it's basically boils down to this, right? Set up the goals, what I'm trying to do. From that, try to figure out what the methodology that I might use to answer these questions. And then from there, get down into the brass tacks, the details of how I'm actually going to go about executing on this. So there's a bunch of different things we can look at, right? And I'll talk about some of the different ways in which we can answer some of the questions that might be generated as we go along. I'll take another pause point. Any questions, thoughts? Is this tracking?
I'm actually interested to know how, if everyone that has already a research plan, just raise your hand. Awesome. 2? Great. So maybe it's a good thing. So Eliana, I don't know, want to tell us a little bit, what's
Yeah.
your overall research plan?
Yeah, kind of like similar to what you're showing here, but ours is like from, both sides of the user experience, from retailer and customer. So they're obviously like slightly different, but with the same goal in mind. So definitely having like in mind the different users that are interacting.
Fantastic. Yeah. And that's one of the things that could conceivably be part of your plan to start out with, of course, is like, who are my users in general, right? You reach the point where you say, okay, I have this understanding of the two of them, right? And I can dig further. But that's one of the things I'm observing in like what the work you guys are doing. One of the things that's challenging in SaaS platforms, or B2B platforms, excuse me, I should say, right, is understanding the different types of users you have there. An example, like you're working on a marketplace type of situation, right? So I got my merchants and my consumers, right? Some of the others aren't quite the same because it might be that your actual customer is in the middle between you and the end customer, right? But you still have to have, so for example, I'm thinking like financial platforms types of things where it might be, oh, the actual end user is somebody else who I don't actually really interact with much, right? But you still have to have an understanding of them in order to create the products that help your actual direct customers solve the needs of the customer that's another step removed. That one's gonna be very interesting and tricky, right? Yeah, Jacobo.
Hi, Hunter. Gunther, sorry.
No, good.
Gunther, I'm really surprised about your, I don't know how to say this, is maybe your holistic way of seeing the whole UX process, but what about our stage? Because now we are in a very early beginning of the process of building our products.
Mm-hmm.
So my feelings are around this idea that yes, we have to embrace all the UX process, but considering the financial strengths and all that stuff, what would you consider that could be the minimum UX process possible? I don't know how to say this,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if this makes sense. That I would love to have your idea or your recommendation about how do you consider that we should embrace this process considering our financial strengths, and how we could insert that step in our development pipeline, as you just said.
It's a constant challenge, even at larger organizations, to get all of this stuff and do everything that's the ideal best case, right? So part of in me putting forward a lot of this stuff is I'm trying to show a lot of the different ways in which you can accomplish it. No expectation that you would do every single thing, right? But hopefully as we go through and I provide some of the other possible techniques, there might be one that sort of fits within the stage that you're at right now. An example that we'll get to later is the difference between just doing, say, research by just talking to the people you know versus being able to do metrics analysis that requires that you have had a product out for years and have lots and lots of users, right? Some of those are just unrealistic at different stages, right? So as we walk, part of this also, in order to answer your specific question, is since I only have a vague sense of where you guys are at right now based on those descriptions, I won't be able to give exactly point recommendations at the moment until I learn a little bit more about what you're doing, right? But recognize your question, right? You don't have infinite resources to do these things. You need to be targeted with what you're doing, right? So particularly at the stage you guys are at, right? The main one I'm going to advocate, which we can move on to and I'll talk about, is just specifically directly talking to customers, right? As far as the research stuff goes, right? Just the people talk to them, gather information that you have from them, right? Because they're going to be the best ways to inform it. And then how you leverage that information will somewhat form over time as you see what you have, right? Does that make any sense? Because again, it's too much to try to do all these things, right? But that's why I wanted to give an overview of here's some possibilities, but you're going to have to narrow it down to like where you are and what you're doing at the moment. That satisfactory or makes sense?
Yes, thank you very much.
Absolutely. I mean, for example, and Leo and I were talking about this the other day, right? But one easy thing to do is just try to do surveys of people, right? Easy and handy. Now, going back to what Leo and I were talking about, you have to be careful sometime with doing some of these things, because you might not get the right signal on stuff, but sometimes it's just really easy. Doesn't take much, any technology infrastructure. I am a huge advocate of using the tools that are out there, and you'll see this repeatedly, right? Google Sheets, forms, all that sort of stuff. You don't have to have a whole bunch of fancy equipment in order to go start gathering information from people and compiling it, right? It doesn't take a lot. It takes a few, having some questions and just sort of getting things out there to get started, right? So that's why I'm saying an example would be like a quick survey of people. It goes back and forth, right? You might not get as many responses as you want. You always have to take into account like the sample size you're working on, but some of these are ways to start building out your techniques and thinking about them, right? And you can see here things like what's the best description of your job title are things you can get good signal from for stuff like surveys, right? Nuance of other feelings and that sort of thing don't come through on them, but it's a good way to start like formulating other ideas and help augment other techniques. Right? Here's a big one, and this one is huge for me, just going into some of these techniques, is talking to people and recording or saving the information. This is huge, right? And I see this at a lot of the companies I've been at. You got customer service people, you got product people, you got designers. Everybody goes and talks to folks. They take their notes, and then it ends up sitting in their particular one Google Drive or, in their notebook or wherever, right? And then all this information is very siloed, right? And not accessible. It's very easy, right, nowadays to be able to record calls, right? Zoom, et cetera, you can make video recordings of them. And there are a lot of new annotation, or rather I should say transcription tools out there that are relatively affordable that allows you to get like what everybody said. Is it 100% accurate all the time? No, but at the very least, that's oftentimes much easier than having to write it down when you're talking to somebody, right? Another one that I advocate, and this is a tool that you can see examples of it right here that I've been using a lot. I will pipe them. It's called Grain. And basically what it is it's a tool that combines the ability to show videos, do a transcription, and then allow you to make highlights, right, of particular sections of that video. An example here being like we were looking at an interface, we're talking about it and that sort of stuff. And this is a great way to gather that information and then share it amongst your peers, colleagues, et cetera. Right. So I highly recommend taking a look at tools like this. And this is applicable at any stage, right? Some of these, you can get like basic accounts and a lot of this stuff without it being too cost effective, and then scale as you go, or too cost heavy, right? Another one, going back, right, to the idea of what we're saying about like using, Google tools, right? This is what we do extensively, right? And it takes a bit of discipline to do it, but every time I have a call, I have a form, like a Google form that I go and just fill out with basic information. It populates a spreadsheet, and there it is, right? And the other nice thing about anything that can contain a whole bunch of links is like I could have my notes stored almost anywhere, right? I just put a link in there that says, oh, here's the notes of the video recording, here's the notes of, that I wrote by hand or what have you. But then you get these things all in one sort of one place that other people can refer to, you can look back at and start mining. I mean, here's a quick example of that. I just don't, and you can do stuff like, basic analysis to see who we've been talking to is an example here, right? And so on. I found this to be a very simple technique that anybody can use, again, at any stage, right? And builds dividends over time. Because it's really a pain to go back and try to build things up after you've gone past them. It's better to start and build from there, right? As opposed to having to go hunt down where everything is. And Leo, what's up?
Yeah, so would it be appropriate to say that with respect to call logging, the thing is to have a process to make sure that you're consciously and systematically grabbing feedback and making sure that you're understanding the key things you want out of that conversation, right? That has to do with the initial plan. What are going to be your goals every time you have a call with someone? What do you want to find out? And be very methodical about how you do this every single time, you and everyone that works with you, right? That's the overall big, right?
Ideally, right? One has a sort of a plan with like, I have a certain set of questions that I ask everybody every time, and then other specific ones, right? I think though, it's also practically speaking, it's better to just capture anything over time than having to have like, it's got to be particularly strict in everything, right? Just think of it this way. It's better to have like a bucket of information that you throw everything into, and maybe it's not perfectly organized to start out, but at least it's there, right? And you can go back to it versus it being like nowhere you can find it, right? That's applicable too for a lot of other things, right? Also, when we get into like metrics and other, sort of like more in-depth analytic capabilities. Yeah, Giacomo.
Sorry, I'm here again.
Yeah.
One question about in Scrum, we deal with this process from our product team, where we are gathering user stories in order to understand exactly what the users should need to be done, in the next sprint of development. What according to your experience, because I feel that like this is not the same, but it's a previous process than creating a user story and filling up your backlog, your sprint backlog. Yeah. So what do you think that we should do in order to have a better or a proper UX preparation of those user stories creation, and how do you feel that your product team should be structured, because at the end, my feelings is that the ideal way of having your product team is with some guy who is in charge of writing all those user stories. That my feelings is that process should be with someone with a lot of UX experience. I'm right, or what's your experience, or what's the best practice in this matter?
Well, that's a good question. This is one that when we talk about the overlap between different disciplines or functions within the group, right? The line between design and, design and product management is often fuzzy, right? The hope is that you've got somebody who's got an understanding both directions. And that's one of the reasons why you see the term product designer used a lot more, right? It's a designer who has a strong understanding of product, right? And in product, what we mean is like, the goals that the user is trying to achieve, right? Our business goals and objectives and how we're going to measure this sort of stuff, right? The ability to understand, things like trade-offs that you might be having and how you prioritize, right? So that's one of where you really want to have an overlap between them. So yes, it should be somebody who has a strong understanding of user experience, but obviously the other thing this person who's, writing these stories, and really in a sprint context, needs to have to understand is engineering resources, capabilities, and so on and so forth. So it's a little bit of that. And that's why oftentimes it's the product manager who sort of does have an overlap across those, who makes those calls. But the other part that you were asking too, though, does have a lot to do with the specific cadence and time frame that you're working on, right? And that's one of the things that can be very tricky, that you may all have experienced, between doing like design, product definition and design, and then overlaying that onto like the sprint cycle, right? Because yes, say you work on a 2-week cycle, right? That's actually not very long. And so you have to really parse down exactly what you expect to look at and accomplish in those versus saying, oh, I'm doing this over the course of a quarter or a year, right? And so for some of these things, right, when you're actually getting into, say, the sprint cycle and making quick decisions, that's where a lot of like, you're moving forward. And this is the pre-work, i.e. of understanding people, making decisions that are then very, very measurable, right, in a short term, right? I am going to make feature X, right, and I'm going to release it, and I have the ability to see what numbers change over the course of that time, right? And so that's one of the key distinctions between them. Hopefully this is addressing some of your question there, right? But where some of these methodologies just don't work as well in a certain manner of operating, right? Again, so because, right, sure, if you can have a conversation with somebody and you got it measured every 2 weeks, I mean, that's a short period of time to get somebody, make sure you got them on the phone and get a statistical sampling all the time, right? Yeah, sure, you can do that if that's all you're doing, but if you've got other duties, sometimes you have to think, okay, in order to track for a sprint, I need to, say, measure with some of the other things I'll mention further on, which are much more metrics and sort of log analysis oriented. That making sense?
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Okay, another question.
Yeah. Hi.
Yeah, Luis.
My question is about this, not the code logging per se, but the process of logging and testing everything, right? So basically, what we follow is that when we have a clickable prototype or something like that, we usually have these talks with users where we test how easy it is for them to do a process. But in the roadmap of product development, you have these interviews first, like, okay, this is the need that they have, and this is what the initial design is going to be, right? So the testing over there, how much into the interview we need to like get into? For example,
Sure.
I don't know if I'm making myself clear, but
yeah, absolutely. I do understand. I think I understand where you're going with this. And part of it is like, one of the things we're talking a little bit right now, and actually, why don't I jump forward to some of these others? Because one of the things that we're initially thinking of with this regard is how we're actually sort of like describing and characterizing your users. And I will get to your question in just a second, but let me jump through some of this real quick. Right. In the sense of like, some of these things we're talking about at the beginning are kind of like what we call my generative research or an understanding of these types of people we're working with to begin with, right? It's not directly applicable to the specific product quite yet. It's just me understanding who they are, what motivates them, and that sort of thing, right? And you guys might have seen this before, the question of like a persona, right? Some way to describe a shorthand that gives me to say, okay, these are what these types of people are, that are going to be using my tool. These are some characteristics about them, motivations, et cetera, right? And these can be very handy to start out with and help inform your product decisions, right? And what you're deciding to drive at and who you're deciding to go for. An example being, as we just said before, Liliana is talking about, we might have the merchant and the consumer, right? Going on in there. But those are also going to be nuanced further, of course, because of the particular area you're working in, right? In that case, it's going to be, well, this is a fashion, a clothing retailer, right? So they're going to be thinking about certain things. And then a clothing consumer is going to have certain characteristics that they are going to be interested in, right? That will help determine how we describe them further. So a lot of this is material that comes from surveying, knowing your people, and all that sort of stuff in order to create these sort of descriptions that help us guide, right, the further end. So going back to also the question of like making the user stories, right? That's one of the things that ties back into here. As a user of this type, I want to do X, right? Leads to some of those things when we're defining the stories further. Leo, question there.
Yeah, very quickly, I just wanted to double down the importance of this and connect it with something that many of you have already heard. We've had Jonathan Fenske mentoring some of you, and he repeated once and again, ruthless segmentation. What does that mean? Be very specific on who really you're attending, understanding if they earn a lot of money, don't earn a lot of money, if they have children, don't have children, and be very understanding of the story so that you really understand how the problem is affecting them and then how you're solving that. So I just wanted to double down on that because it really connects with something that many of you have been already told to look into. This is the materialization of that.
And another thing that's important to remember in this is creating these sort of descriptions is definitely a multidisciplinary, multifunctional sort of conversation, right? These should be based in data, right? They should be, informed by business goals and all that sort of thing. And again, this is one of the other areas you have to remember saying, like, describing these things isn't describing yourself, right? It isn't just making something up. It really does need to be influenced by your direct research and also narrowly focused to target your goals as a business, right? All of these things, by the way, have pros and cons within them too. And that's another thing to be important to remember. It's like their strengths and weaknesses, right? They're useful tools, but not everything is like the total ultimate source of truth a lot of the time, right? But just to give you an example, here's a few examples of the way people might be doing this before. You can see, in one case, like Rebecca, who this is like somebody who might be making a music app, right? We've got somebody who's an accountant, that sort of thing, a small business owner who might be flying, right? Type of thing, things to take into, that, and all this again is like, should be based on research and should be basically, it's a shorthand to help people understand. And that's another one of the things that's important about these is oftentimes across different groups within a company, people might have a very different idea of who that user is. Some of these things are good, so that gives you a baseline. It's like, look, when I'm talking about this is what I mean. People can agree or disagree with that, but at the very least, you're not talking about some vague notion that's only in your head, right? Or only in their head, right? It's like, this is concrete. This is who we're talking about, right? And that makes oftentimes, again, communication and decision-making easier. These, of course, would also be constantly refined as your business grows. I give you a good example from work at Drone Deploy, right? When the company started out, our primary users were what we call DSPs, drone service providers, individuals, small business owners, right? But that was like 4 or 5 years ago. In the time since, we've transitioned to like, it's a full enterprise company, right? And yes, those people are still users, but they're not the primary drivers of activity in business anymore. Now we're talking like, it's construction managers, like people who organize big teams. And even more so, it's like key executives who are making the purchasing decisions, because now the software doesn't cost $50 a month. It costs $500,000 a year type of thing, right? And so that really changes it. You got to be very focused on that, particularly for you guys when you're talking about B2B and SaaS businesses, right? Okay. Here's it. Then to exactly that. That's one of the things to think about with regards to these sort of like creating personas. One, like the notion of the user, right? The people who are going to be using the tool, and then the other one is like buyers, right? The people who buy it, who might not be the same people at all. So going back, this is to Leo's point, something important, particularly as you guys work on this B2B stuff.
Yeah, I'm just gonna say again, we had another sales call earlier this week with Daniel Ponce, and he was telling you, okay, when you have your sales strategy, you really need to know who you're talking to, who's gonna be your champion, who's gonna be the decision maker, and because they have different roles, different personalities. So at some extent, each one is gonna be a different persona. And you need to know the approach that you're gonna be having with them.
Another thing that's interesting too, of course, is, and this is also a very interesting one when we talk about these kind of business, is what your growth model is based on. Is it going to be bottom up or top down, right? And it's very common now for people to think of it's like the users, right, are the ones who actually get it adopted within an organization. The classic example would be Slack, right? Slack started out with, it was just a tool they released to everybody, and people just, whoever in an organization just started using it, right? Eventually, it worked its way up to becoming a, basically the ubiquitous tool that businesses use, right? Adopted by enterprises. Probably an example the other way would be like Salesforce in a certain extent, right? It's like it's purchased, right? And then people use it, but it's decided upon by the larger, the higher ups, and then put out there as the tool that everybody needs to use. Right. And that, as you guys are thinking about that, it depends again on like who you're going to be targeting. Right. I'm going to assume a lot of folks who you guys are working on stuff is going to be a little bit more bottom up, but it might be that you're jumping up quickly to being like talking to the buyers and purchasers who are going to tell their people, okay, this is what you use now. So that's one of the reasons why this sort of thing is very important to keep in mind, particularly as you look at how you're interfacing with marketing, et cetera, and dividing those responsibilities up. Right. Okay. Jumping into some of those other questions that actually came up, Louis, a little bit earlier, it's like, okay, right, how do we actually go and test things? I think is one of the things you were trying to target there, right? So given that we've all, right, figured out a lot about who we're using, we're building a product and stuff, how do I get it out there to actually get people to understand that these things that I'm working, I've just developed actually fit the bill, right? And you've probably all heard the term usability before. Usability is also something not to be too intimidated by, right? Because basically all you really need is the tool itself, right? And getting on the phone with somebody. But of course, a plan specifically targeting what you want to know about this thing you're putting in front of people, right? So again, you don't have to have a whole bunch of fancy tools in order to do this. I'm a fan of just getting on the phone with people and using a spreadsheet. There's a couple of different tools out there that can help you gauge these sort of things. And there's some examples of them here, all right, of some of the stuff I've written in the past, but there's ways in which you know, just like a basic, like sort of, as you walk somebody through them, get them to answer a series of questions, which are kind of yes and no, right, on certain things. Like, for example, I think this, I would use this system frequently, yes or no, right, balanced with questions like, I found the system complex, yes or no, right, can help define sort of an overall assessment of what the usability of something is, right? There's a few links here I highly recommend, by the way, just out there, if you guys want to look up information, a broad swath of information about all this sort of stuff, 2 key areas to look at, something called the Interaction Design Foundation, which is an international sort of like group that does a lot of work around user experience and so on and so forth. Tons of resources there. The other one of my favorites is a company called the Nielsen Norman Group, which is a consultancy run by 2 of the basically luminaries within this whole field, Jacob Nielsen and Don Norman, right? And they have a consultancy that does stuff and publishes scads of material that's worth looking into, right? So just a few resources to take a look at for a bunch of this stuff. I do recommend, by the way, however, there are a lot of like usability tools that are out there, right? And again, usability being, I have a sequence, an action that I want people to understand if it's working for people, right? I have a series of steps that I want them to be able to take. And what I'm trying to gauge is, do they understand it or not? How do I nuance in there what might be incorrect, what might need refinement, right? And some of that can be very complex, right? But so one of the things with is going through here is leveraging, there are a lot of tools out there that you can use. One of the ones that I've been a big fan of lately is called Maze, right? But there's some other ones that are well-known, like usertesting.com. Now, these have the advantage of allowing you to disseminate them and distribute them across a wide audience, right? And do what we might call asynchronous testing, right? Where people can just go and interact with something and you don't have to be there to administer the tests. However, sometimes when you're starting out earlier, right, and where you guys are, it might be easier to actually get people on the phone and have them walk through something, right? Oftentimes you can understand what's going on and what, you know, whether or not you need changes based on a fairly small sample size, right? It only takes like 5, 7 conversations to understand if something more or less works or just plain doesn't, right? So that's the other thing to remember too. It's like when you're doing some of these things, you don't have to have like 100 people involved with them. Sometimes it just takes talking to a small number of people, but in a consistent fashion, right? I have one set of questions I'm going to ask everybody, right? And then see how they interact with it. That making sense? There's a lot, but this is another one we can really dive deep on them, but just to bring it out there as part of the things in the toolkit. And Louis, I think this is kind of going back to some of the questions you were starting to ask, like how would I test and validate things? Are we getting there with some of this?
Yeah, actually. But for example, in the roadmap from the user research to the testing, is there any way like to do the same usability test while we have the first sketches for the design?
Oh, yes, 100% that's possible. There's a wide variety of ways and levels of what you call fidelity that you can test people, right? You don't have to have a fully built out prototype in order to get some signal from people on whether or not something works, right? You may have heard the term paper prototyping, right? Sometimes all you really need to do is like have a basic sketch. Actually, I don't have a good example of this in this deck, but like, for example, one of the things I did was I made I had really quick doodles in a Google, slide presentation, right? That I just sort of sent out to people and allowed them to sort of like step through it and give some feedback on, right? You can do the same thing. People call it a cafe test, for example. A little different, obviously. I mean, well, hopefully we're moving into this post-COVID world where you can like get together with people in a cafe more often. But the idea there might be, I've got a series of sketches just on paper and I show it to somebody and say, okay, look at this. What would you do, right? If you wanted to accomplish X, and they go, maybe I'd touch that thing right there or whatever, right? And you go, okay, if you did that, right, here's my next piece of paper. And you see this, what would your reaction be, right? And this is the kind of thing you can do all the time, all over the place. Depends on your audience, right? But hey, take it home and show it to your parents and see what they do, right? That sort of thing. So there's a wide variety of sort of levels, again, of complexity, right, to go through. And you shouldn't necessarily think that you can get some information, that you can only get information if you've got something very, very involved, very, very complex to share with people. Is that getting at what you're asking there?
Yeah, thank you.
Again, all of these things, the things to remember, right? The audience you're talking to, is it the one that I'm actually aiming at, right? And if so, that's great. If not, you can still learn things from people, right? You just have to take that into account. Like, for example, oh, if my target audience is a 25-year-old audiophile and I show this thing to my parents, I just have to take that into account that their music tastes might be different, right? Or habits or what have you, right? Okay. Here's another one that you guys all might have heard of that sort of brings a bunch of these things together and is well worth taking into account. This is a well-known technique that combines a bunch of this stuff we talked, that sort of is talked about before, and in a way to do something quickly, right, and come up with a potential solution to a problem you might have posed. And that's what's called the design sprint, right? Made particularly famous by a fellow named Jake, who was at Google Ventures for a long time and wrote a book and tested this out on dozens and dozens of startups, many of which are about probably at the stage you guys are at. So it's something that's well worth looking into and exploring. Basically what it is a way to take like a dedicated week with a set of stakeholders and participants where you define a problem, right, that you have to begin with. You come up with a bunch of different sort of concepts on how you might solve that problem, narrow it down to a few, right, and then do a quick prototype, which you would then validate with a number of different, like with research of various kinds, contacting people, that sort of thing, right? One of the things that you'll see emphasized here, right, in this design is that a lot of people talk about the multi-diamond. Sometimes it's the double diamond. This is the triple diamond. But the idea of how you go about and explore ideas by starting narrow, going wide, and then having a process by which you can narrow it down again, right? Then when you need to, after you've learned something about those decisions, going wide again in order to understand, and then narrowing down. And you can see that in here. Like first, it's just sort of going broadly to understand what the problem is or who I'm working for. So we go wide, right? Then we need to narrow it down to like specifically the question we're trying to answer, right? Then we go and brainstorm, come up with a whole bunch of different ways we might solve it, right? Then narrow it down to which one we actually want to try, right? Then we take that thing we want to try, show it to a bunch of people, right? See what they have to say, consolidate down the information we received in order to make a final decision. Example below is one that I did at Circle Up. And the other thing too is that this is the other thing really now, right? You can do remotely. There's ways to do these things. We're not all in the same room. A few years ago, that all seemed very revolutionary. Now we're all like, yeah, whatever, we can do everything remote, which is liberating in some ways, but also, sometimes it is nice to be all gathered together. Questions, thoughts there? Is this something people have heard about? I would assume lots of folks have. Okay. Digging deeper, some of the other things as we're moving forward, right? Let's time check here. Pretty good. At a certain point, when you've got stuff out there, it's necessary, right, to use analysis tools of various kinds. And I'll just put out the question for you guys. Is anybody doing this sort of thing? Logs analysis, metrics, and that sort of thing at this point? And what tools are you using?
We are using a little bit of QuickSight from Amazon Web Services. Is QuickSight. But to be honest, we feel and we believe that we are far away from what we should be measuring right now.
Yeah, this is one of the ones that's trickier, right? Ultimately, you'll want to be able to do this, right? Two of the ones that I've named here are fairly common. Mixpanel, right, is one of the big players in this space now. And then of course, obviously, Google is always in there, right? Google has got Google Analytics, but there's also this other component they have called Google Data Studio, right? Which gives you even further in-depth ability to basically understand what's going on in your logs, right? I see another question. I'll pause there. Lewis, what's on your mind?
Yeah. What other tools do you recommend, like in order to get the data needed for not only decision making, but for the designing part of the roadmap? Because I've been recommended to use a heat map so that I can like get the data on how much someone accessing this part of the platform or things like that. What other tools do you recommend in this stage that we are?
Yeah, there are a few out there that allow you to do things like heat map tracking, right? And now some of these tools that we show here will do that, right? I think Mixpanel may actually have a heat map tracking component to it as well. But one of the ones I can come off and I can say right off the bat that I really like, Hotjar is one that's been out there that I've used. And then one of my other favorites for tracking what people are doing is called Full Story. Now, the thing about a lot of these is they're useful, right? Their business model, of course, is to charge people for it, right? So you just have to take some of those things into account. Every single one of these, like, it's easy to ramp up where they're like, yeah, you know, I want to charge you the enterprise account for this. And you're like, I'm a startup, dude. I can't quite do that right now. But most all of them will have at the very least basic accounts that allow you to do a simple analysis. So there's a few to take a look at. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Now, because the other thing is there's a few other things you need to take into account when doing metrics analysis, right? One is particularly when you talk about things like, and might have come up with Liana mentioned, and that sort of thing is like onboarding, right? How we get people signing up and that sort of thing. And you know, marketing areas, like the funnel by which you start with people and end up with them in the system, right, is one thing. The other one is, as you're mentioning, Louis, though, is also like very in-depth looking at what's going on a specific page, like by heat mapping and individual events, right? And they are not necessarily always the same thing, right? One is very focused on a particular scenario and the other is a long sequence of events, right? But tools like Mixpanel will allow you to do that. Sorry, hold on just a second. Yeah.
Necesito $10 para pagar el agua.
Okay. Sorry. Sorry, the water delivery is here. That's one of the joys of working at home, right? Is like, well, you know, life still goes on, and every now and then you've got to do something. Okay, sorry. Where were we? Well, actually, it gives an opportunity to move on to the next topic that we're talking about, which is how we do other kinds of testing, particularly focused on things like funnels, metrics, and all that sort of stuff. And Leo mentioned that this might have been a good one to call out for you guys, right? Which is this notion of what we call A/B testing, which is how you take a look at two different versions of something and see which one would be the most effective, right? Or it can help drive what you're trying to get to, what you're trying to achieve with a particular design, right, or sequence. Is this something that people are familiar with at all? Right? Yeah. Now, this is best done, right, when you have a working prototype, well, not necessarily a prototype, but a working product that you then have the infrastructure to actually drive and target traffic to, right? So I can actually say, oh, if somebody arrives at my site or my app, I can send you this way and you this way, right? It's harder when you're not quite as far along and haven't ever did those stuff built out, but there are other ways you can do this, leveraging some of the earlier techniques. Right? If I had, say, two possible ways to do something, I could go back and use some of my usability techniques, including interviewing people, and just show, you know, have a set where I've got 10 people say, I show 5 one version and I show 5 the other version, right? And that can give you another signal to see which one seems to be, you know, the most effective. But this is definitely best when you've got something set up, you've got a product that's actually deployed, and then you can track what people are actually doing. And there's a couple of there's quite a few tools out there that accommodate this. One is one that there's actually a link to here. It's called VWO, is an interesting one. Another tool we'll look at, which is called Optimizely, right? If you may have heard of Optimizely. Optimizely is very marketing, funnel oriented, but it can be a very handy tool, particularly in these stages where you guys are looking at like driving people in the product, right? Getting them to do sign up and all that sort of thing, and understanding what it is that, how they're making it through this funnel and where the leaks are. Another version of this is what you'd actually call variant testing, which is a bit more of a sophisticated technique. And usually when you're further down the road, because what it involves is like doing more than 2 versions of something, right? It's like you might have 4 or 5 out there, right? But this requires a bit of a larger audience in order to be able to like segment things, and so that you get like statistical significance from them. Won't go all the way in depth on some of this A/B testing stuff, but it's definitely something you should consider and look into. Again, something important that you have a strong concept of the questions you're trying to answer. Sorry, folks, I had a little internet glitch there.
I think it was a couple of us, because I see some people jumped out. I don't
Let's
see
blame
you.
Zoom. Zoom's fault.
Yeah, I think it was a group thing.
Yeah, all right. Can you guys still see my screen again?
Yep.
Okay. Well, on that, while I'm waiting to connect here real quick, something is happening. Any questions there?
Ileana?
Yeah, so this kind of goes back more to like the user research. But if you have any tips, to making sure that the way that you're framing the questions and just like the whole experience is as least biased as possible, right? Because there's a part where before you show them product, you want to kind of like understand what their pain points are without first maybe introducing like what your product is, in case they kind of skew their answers towards that. So any, I guess, advice you have on ways to approach it with enough context, but maybe not giving away like too much.
Right. That is a great question. It's hard to do, right? And it takes practice and patience is one of the other things, the main things, right? Particularly when you're conducting a lot of these kinds of questions, you need to allow people to just answer, right? And not try to push them to answer quickly, or maybe in the time frame that you want them to, right? I will confess, as a extroverted person who talks, sometimes I find that to be a struggle sometimes. I'm like, come on, let's get there, right? But the best thing to do is put your question out, just sit, wait, and listen, right? Now, that's not the same thing as actually framing the question, right? But they're combined with each other. And the thing about framing the question is what we want to do first off is rely on what we've learned about these people in general beforehand, right? And then very specifically put it into terms of like, let's say you want to do this task or this thing or accomplish this goal. How would you do that given what I am presenting to you? And that's kind of it. And then just wait and see what people do. And so it's a combination too of what they might say, right? As well as what the actions that they take, right? So you have to combine those two as well. And the other one that I often find is the case with people particularly when you're conducting like usability research, that sort of thing, people have this unfortunate tendency to be very apologetic and take it like it's their fault, right? And so one of the other things to remember too is always put it in the terms of like, no, it's it's not you, it's not us. This is open. There's no judgment here, types of things, and giving them the space to like, it's kind of a vulnerability thing, right? Allow them to just sort of express themselves openly without feeling like there's a right or wrong answer. Does that address some of your question there?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah. It's hard. And I know some people who are just like super good at it. They can just say like 3 words and then people are, I was saying this to Leo the other day. It's like, then they just talk, right? And they'll, you can get people to say all sorts of things, right? So yeah. And then the other thing too, of course, is like, also let people go where they're going to go, right? Sometimes somebody will answer your question. Maybe that's happening now, right? And it won't even be what your actual question is, right? But that's how you build up that trust to get back to the real thing. It's just not by constantly trying to steer it. It's like if somebody just goes way over here, right? Sometimes that's okay. And then it'll take the gentle nudge. It's like, okay, that's very interesting. I'm taking note of that, right? That I'm glad to hear you express those types of things. But what do you think about this other thing that we've been talking about before and steer them around? Because the other thing, of course, is sometimes people's deviations provide very interesting insights, right? But part of it, the other one that I would advocate for when you're putting these together, and particularly with usability studies, is putting together a script, right? You can have a script that say, these are the things, and you be sure you say that. You start out like with an icebreaker for somebody, say, hey, it's nice to meet you, right? And then articulate what you really want to accomplish, right? Throughout, and then you can, and that can often help. In particular, when you're trying to normalize across a bunch of these anecdotal kinds of things, doing the same thing over and over again helps you have results that are, you can compare to each other. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Okay, just a second here. We all had a little bit of a blurb there. I'm actually pretty close to the end of the things that I wanted to share there. I can pull that back up again. But the thing I wanted to end on, actually, there's only one more thing, was another type of tools that are worth considering and taking into account are other kinds of engagement tools, and particularly like onboarding types of stuff. And the ones I was going to mention here in particular that we've used a lot is one called Intercom, right? Which is a tool that you can integrate into your products, right? And allows you to talk directly to them. I'm sure you've all seen this. It's the little thing in the lower corner that pops up and there's like a conversational aspect to it. But the other thing that it includes is tools to help you with like onboarding people once they've signed up, right? Things like that, which is very critical for what you guys are working on now. And the other one is actual analysis of their behaviors afterwards. Right. So it's not just the conversational chat widget in the corner, but it's also a way to actually get a stronger understanding of your tools and users. And the other one that's worth thinking about, which I have mixed feelings about, is tools that allow you to gather like NPS surveys. And are you guys all familiar with NPS? NPS means Net Promoter Score, and it's a gauge that people use to see if they like or don't like your thing. It can be very simple. It's useful to get a signal, right? And it's very common to hear people talk about it and use it nowadays, right? So worth looking into, right, to give you a sense. But I also have mixed feelings about it because it requires quite a bit of like nuance and analysis to actually make real use of, and is oftentimes more useful later on in your cycle when you've got when you're thinking about like brand issues, and much more so, right? Like when the company's bigger and you're like really trying to gauge, why do people like or not like us, which is not something that is necessarily always that big a deal when you're starting out, right? Your main one is you just want people to know about you, right? Versus like have an opinion one way or the other. Right, an airline, a big airline, yes, everybody knows that they exist, and people hate them or love them or whatever, right? That matters for them. From when you're just trying to get your name out there, getting people to say I like you in the same kind of way isn't the same thing. So, okay, cool. Hopefully this was helpful. Are there other questions and things that you guys would like to talk about in the 10 minutes we got left here?
Hey, Gunther, I had a quick
Yeah.
question. When you said the tools for onboarding, which one would you recommend?
Well, the one I mentioned, this is like as a tool for getting onboarding, Intercom is a good one. In addition to like, again, like that chat bot they actually have tools you can integrate in there that are like you've just signed up, here's the things to do, here's a tour, yada, yada, yada. So that can help for there, right? Let's see, what else have we been using? There's a few
What
other.
would you recommend for not, let's say, onboarding for not too tech savvy people? Let's say like factory workers in South America, which they don't have access to a computer, let's say.
Well, so there you go. That's another question too, of like, yeah, who you're trying to get to use these things and how they're using them, right? So in this case, we're talking about factory workers, right? How would they be using these tools at all? I mean, are we talking about somebody on the line, like, you know, and they're using a piece of software that's part of the job or something else? So that one I could actually use some more context on in order to answer that question.
So basically we have let's say we have the office people that do have access to computers. That one's easier onboarding. And then we have, let's say, the factory workers who can order our menu, let's say, through WhatsApp. So basically they're only interacting through a message.
Through WhatsApp.
Yeah.
That is a specific tools on that. I don't actually have a great answer off the top of my head. Ways you might go about that, if basically what you're talking about is essentially getting people onboarded through essentially a chat interface, right? But like a limited one, WhatsApp. If all you're doing is prompting them to like order lunch, some of that might be fairly simple. How about this? Let's talk about that. Let's set up some more time and we can talk about that one more in depth, because I need to think about that for a second to give you a better answer than what I just did. Right. Okay. But it's a good question, because there is a lot of that interfacing that's basically, yes, through WhatsApp at this point. Right. And that's it. So it's essentially just chat. Right. And then the other question is how much onboarding is even necessary for these people? Right. How complicated do you need to make that, aside from like, here's the menu, pick one, you know, if it's being distributed. Right. So it might be that it's like actually less of a complicated question than it seems, but I'll need to know a little bit more about like what other requirements you might have of these people and that sort of thing, right, in order to give a better answer on that.
Okay, perfect. Thanks so much, Gunther.
Yeah, no, totally. No, actually, now I'm thinking about that. It's kind of an interesting one. And there you go. That's one of the things, Bobby, can I say this? It's great interfacing with y'all in some of these areas, because different regions obviously have different ways people interact with technology, different cultural norms, you know, access to technology and all that sort of thing. And it's been certainly fascinating to me over these last 2 years, talking with you folks across Latin America and seeing what some of the significant differences are that you have to take into account. Example I was giving earlier with regard to product design, I've spent a lot of time like also doing stuff between like basically in Asia, for example, right? And if you look at the difference between what you do for design, right, across say Japan versus the United States, it's like there's very significant differences in the way people interact with things, what they expect to have, you know, the level of information that people are, you know, comfortable with and all that sort of stuff. So it's always important, right, and interesting to get that perspective, because yes, there might be an overlap of like 90% on things, but it's that 10% that makes a difference. An example I would give also too is like, does a thumbs up always mean a positive thing in every country, or is that something that is in some places not actually good, right? For example, sometimes it can be very subtle. All right, cool. Really fun chatting with y'all today. Any other thoughts? Things that we're missing that you'd like to bring up, chat about later? I've got one already.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Who in early stages, as we know, all of them are, who would you assign with the responsibility of being like the UX supervisor? It's not a person that will carry on UX tasks or design, but as a supervisor that follows through on the plans and the measurings and everything.
Well, in general, that'd be the product manager, right? And so I'm going to assume that most all of you have somebody who is in charge of product, right? That can vary, right? And it depends on how you start out. These, you know, what kind of founder y'all are. Some people start out as programmers, some people come at it from marketing or business or whatever, right? But in general, that would start out under the product, right, label, right? right? But I can give you an example. Before, like when I was at Circle Up, basically the product team was the founder, CEO, the head of engineering, and me, right? So, you know, it was like I kind of took on some of those duties because he had a whole bunch of his CEO duties to do as well, but I was technically the designer, but I had the experience to sort of like lead that, you know, overlap, right? But for sure, in particular with gauging success of features and evaluating them at the end, that responsibility 99% of the time falls on product management, right? They're the ones who help guide it through and then are answerable to say, this thing we put out there worked, right?
And when
Does
do
that
you
answer-
hire your UX guy or girl? When's that tipping point?
Depends on what level of complexity the product has reached, right? If you have the resources to continue. And then of course, also when you define as your target audience. Here's another one I'd say, right? We all want to think that we're creating beautiful, you know, super engaging interfaces that are lovely to look at and, you know, have, you know, flowers bursting everywhere or whatever, like surprise and delight types of things, right? But the fact of the matter is that depending on your audience, some of that matters and some of it doesn't as much, right? Again, pointing out to, talking about fashion retail, yeah, visuals, aesthetics are going to be a key component of it, right? Somebody who really needs to see that list of like finance or whatever, my task list of the things I need to accomplish today, you know, a spreadsheet thing that just like has the information right there might be all you need, right? So that a lot of it really varies on who your audience is, right, and what your business goals are in order to determine what type of designer you also need there, right, when you actually come down to it. So particularly if you've got somebody who's like a strong product manager who knows how to articulate, like, here's the scenarios that we're working on. I know the audience. These are the specific steps we can go for. And what I really need support in is somebody who's got a strong visual aesthetic or something like that. I mean, one kind of designer you get. Or you might need somebody who comes in, right? Because you've got an engineer who's the founder, no disparagement of engineers here, but sometimes they think in their engineer way, and that is not a way that actual humans actually think about walking through something, right? So you need somebody who's like, hey, I need to put, let me help a little bit with like the human touch of understanding the sequence sort of things, because Mr. Logic, right, this is not actually how people go about it. Again, not to bag on engineers there a little bit, but it's that back and forth, right? And then the other one, of course, is the counterbalance too, because sometimes you might have somebody who's all about business optimize, right? Where you need somebody to be a little bit more like, hey, actually, we need to be a little bit more human understanding on this, right? So that's kind of one of the things that UX ostensibly brings to the group, is a little bit, it's more humanistic, right? In certain ways, different ways to evaluate, and pushing forward that user-centered side of things, right? So product being like business-centered, right? Engineering being technology-centered, design being sort of human-centered, user-centered, and we need to make sure all those things work together in order for the thing to succeed. Is that, yeah? Okay. Cool. Whew. All right, that was a lot of talking there, guys. I hope that was, yeah, again, I really do hope that was helpful. And I look forward to engaging further and learning more about the specific things you guys have all been working on.
Yeah, thank you very much, Gunther, for your time. Jaco, I think that you will be able to address this in office hours whatsoever. So because we have a tight schedule today. So Gunther, again, thank you very, very much for being with us and sharing all these insights. I know that you work extra hard and just trying to handle tools that they can use today. So for every one of you, hopefully it's been worthwhile. And yet again, Gunther will be putting office hours available most likely next week. So we'll be scheduling that offline. For now, again, thanks for everyone for your time. Gunther, thanks for all.
Absolutely. My absolute pleasure to be here with you guys, and I look forward to talking further.
I think we lost Leo there.
I think so.
Thank you all.
All right, everybody. Ciao for now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Ciao.
Thank you very much.
Ciao.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.